So, subscribers will know I've done a revisionist history on multiple things. How Nvidia could have beaten Google Stadia early, how a Phenom 3 would have performed relative to Bulldozer, and of course how Intel could have done a much better job heading off Ryzen. But the truth is, on that last one, I don't think there's any way Intel could have completely. Well, AMD would have taken market share. Ryzen is a better design than their aging, basically souped up Sandy Bridge architecture they're still using. And the same also goes for what happened when Maxwell came out with regards to AMD. There's no way AMD couldn't have hemorrhaged a little bit of market share, or at least not gained any with that generation. But it didn't have to be that bad, in my opinion. That's something I've always thought. And so I got this idea, how much or how to what extent could AMD take on Maxwell, even though their architecture was still GCN and Nvidia had just, in my opinion, clearly made the best gaming architecture they had ever come up with. Well, I started digging again, right? This was years ago, back in 2015. And when I started looking up the R9 300 series, I realized AMD was just their own worst enemy. It was an absolute mess. And, I'm actually going to go to a chart early because I want to show you what I'm talking about right away. All right, let's take a look here at this series. Now, the first thing that's going to jump right out at you, well, it's really two things. How huge this series is, and I just ignored everything below $100 besides the 350, of course. And also how convoluted the segmentation and pricing structure is. I mean, R9, the majority are 9. What does R9 even mean if everything is R9? Look at the memory here. 222 4488 444 again. That's so confusing to consumers. But really, the most egregious thing AMD did with this series was their, my God, hideous rebranding. We had rebrands. That's right, a rebrand of a rebrand, and I believe there were some that were just rebrands of rebrands of rebrands, and it was just so bad. You have cards where some of them have the newest DisplayPort, some of them have the newest HDMI, and some of them need crossfire cables. I mean, I remember like this ridiculous marketing page AMD had where it's like, well, if you buy this one here, and it's not even like it's uniform in like hierarchy, right? Like you go, well, yeah, if you have a 380 or a 380X, no crossfire cables needed. Don't worry. Then you go down here, and it's like, oh no, now you need them again. And then you go down more, and it just goes, oh no, now you don't. Oh, now you do. Like, this is the most ridiculous lineup I've ever seen. AMD truly was their worst enemy, and I really don't even get what their strategy was. Like, do they need to really have a card like every $20? Like, what is going on here? And I remember because I bought a 3090X, which I actually thought was a pretty fantastic card. But at the same time, I mean, in hindsight, I wish it would have been Generation 3. It would have been way more, at least 20% more efficient. It would have looked much better in that light. And you don't want to have a 300-watt card competing with the, like 170, well, I think it was more like 160-watt 980. Like, think of how insane that looks. Even if they had excellent coolers, even if it was, I would argue, a better buy. Like, and then you go, and one of the reasons I bought it is, why would you buy this Fury when it has double the RAM? And this is like 20% stronger, but also 30% more expensive. The RAM, I really think AMD sometimes underestimates how much they destroy their segmentation with RAM here. And this is what really got me to do this video. Seeing this ridiculous lineup got me obsessing over it for about an hour. I decided to walk my dog, and I just paused my podcast in my ears and just started thinking and thinking and thinking about how they really could have done a better job against Maxwell. They didn't have to have these segmentation problems. And it should have been from almost top to bottom Generation 3. Because the fact of the matter is, Generation 3, pre-Polaris and Vega GCM, really wasn't that inefficient. The R9 380 only used a little less energy. I mean, I'm sorry, a little more energy than the 970 while being slightly weaker. It was like a 20% efficiency difference, and it was a card they sold for less. Like, there was no reason they couldn't have scaled up that and kept it all Gen 3 until perhaps the bottom, where it's fine to rebrand as much as you want, around $100 in my opinion. But they didn't do that, and they made mistakes with the Fury series too, which I actually like that name, but they thought, and you can do some digging and find some sources that say this, that Nvidia really was just going to have a Titan and a 980, which is kind of preposterous to think, right? I mean, they released the 780 Ti when you beat the Titan before. Why would you not think they're preparing? They just have that ready to drop when they want to. And so they built the Fury, though, around the idea that what this is going to be is a card to fight the 980 and a card that we can sell for way more that will be marketed as a weaker but cheaper Titan with better cooling. And the 980 Ti just completely blindsided AMD. And so at the last minute, and AIBs were really pissed about this, they were going to sell the Fury, I believe, for 700 or 750, and instead they were forced to sell it for 650 and have small margins. And it still didn't do anything, if you ask me. The 980 Ti used, well, actually about the same amount of energy. And while it was bigger and louder, it was stronger, and it overclocked way better. And it had more RAM. And the Fury was at its best in 4K. It really did trade blows with the Titan in 4K if you weren't running out of VRAM, which most of the time you weren't, so reviewers were generally pretty nice to the Fury. But it still looked bad, and it was competing with it was competing with a 12 gigabyte Maxwell card or a 6 gigabyte one that generally came in a little cheaper. It was a disaster. AMD hemorrhaged tons of market share. They went from, I believe, 35 to 40% market share to like less than 30%. It was very, very bad. Their darkest era, their stock price plummeted. And it was mostly because of the CPUs, to be clear, which I've covered before. But it did. The Radeon didn't help. I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back, too, where people went, not even their GPU division can do anything anymore. AMD's, as you saw the AM dead memes on WCCF. But it could have been better. And so let's take a look at this, because even though I don't think there's any way AMD wouldn't have lost some market share, it didn't have to be that bad. And I think it gets us thinking about segmentation as a whole. And voila, this is the best I could come up with. Now remember, this is the best I can come up with. I think AMD would have undoubtedly lost some market share. Maxwell was a hammer that hit him out of nowhere. But this would have done way better in my opinion. And let's just start at the top, right? And really read this here, and because this is the point, the main problem I have with the Fury series, and that's it's very clear that you can't make this super cheap and do well against big Maxwell. There's no way. This is a gigantic die using experimental, expensive as hell memory. I remember reading it was estimated to be about $150 per 4 gigabytes. There's no way you're doing this, right? And 4 gigabytes makes you look stupid. So it is my opinion they should have segmented it in this, I think, kind of interesting outside the box way. The top one is the absolute best yields. Instead of wasting them on the Fury Nano, which didn't sell well enough, even though, don't get me wrong, I loved the Fury Nano. But the best yields went to that. I had one that I got on sale after, kind of like right when Polaris was coming out. And it overclocked like crazy, but it was limited by an 8-pin. Those incredible yields that they made up for wasting by cheaping out on the fan, again, just ridiculous decision making at AMD, should have been clocked faster and sold as a Titan competitor, and it could have been. If you marked it up $150, it has 8 gigabytes of HBM. This would have been a 4K gaming card if it had this much memory that aged absurdly well. In fact, I would go as far as to say this card would have done, it probably would have done battle almost with the 1080, beaten the 1070. Probably in 4K it would have beaten the 1070 if it had 8 GB of RAM. And AMD really missed it here. They could have taken the best yields, clocked it higher, and again, my Fury Nano, the RAM overclocks to 700 megahertz, and I've seen plenty of people get there too. So this is not ridiculous. It's liquid cooled. As long as you keep Fury cooled, you can overclock that RAM like crazy if you're using the best yields. And the fact is, just from a raw performance point of view, this would have been at least 7% stronger, which people should go look it up. The Fury X did trade blows with the 980 Ti, and the Titan was barely faster. A 7% performance difference would have, with this RAM, would have made it trade blows with the Titan. And if they would have sold it for $200 less with a better cooler and marketed that HBM memory, I really think this could have sold well. And then you just have to do this too. You have to ignore the 980 Ti. There's no way you can do it. Either you use 4 gigabytes or you use 8. If you use 4, it's not competing with the 980 Ti. Sometimes there's a type of product you're making where you just can't make it a mid-range product, and you have to accept that. But AMD didn't accept it, and they wasted their best yields on a card with a cheap little cooler that only had one 8-pin, and their other yields look stupid with less RAM. And the Fury Nano actually, was held back by that cheap cooler that they tried to make so they could justify themselves selling their best yields for $650. No, there's no point in that. Just leave it here, and then it will downclock itself less and make the reference cooler that little cheap one. And they could have sold this for $500 by using the cheaper cooler and cut down yields. They really could have. And then here's what you do. You tell AIBs, hey, guess what? You don't need to follow our reference design. Our reference design is effectively the same performance as a 980 while using slightly less energy with the same amount of RAM, but you want to, spend the $150, make this a $650 card with 8 gigabytes, I guess, right? And then maybe make it $700 with a bigger cooler. I guess. Let the AIBs do whatever they want with all of the extra cut down yields. But the reference design stays something that can be as small as a 980 and sold at the same price or a little less. And they didn't do that either with the Fury. It had these big expensive coolers because they were the worst yields. Again, I really think this would have been a better option. And the next big thing is not rebranding as much, not selling the 390 and the 390X as 8 gig. It really didn't make any sense because it looks so bad, even though the 390 was definitely a better than the 970. And yes, I know it aged better, but at least at launch, the 390 looked like a 970 that used double the energy, even though it had more RAM. And then it also, because it had 8 gigabytes, it made these cards look stupid. But if you gave it 6 gigabytes, you gave it 384-bit and used the latest GCM, it would have been better, a lot better, I think. And there were rumors of a bigger die that could go up to 3072. They just never made it, right? They never did. And this could have been a little bit weaker than a 390 and a little bit stronger than a 390X, which also would be good because the 390X and the 390 were like 8% performance, 8% away from each other in performance, which also made basically no sense. Making a card that's 384-bit, a new die that had 6 gigabytes of RAM, so you spend a little less on RAM, would have made both of them more efficient, and this one a little cheaper to sell. And then this could have been a 970 killer, just a 970 murderer. And going down the list, and I'll address the naming scheme. I almost didn't change the naming scheme, but the naming scheme was so stupid on the 300 series that you can't make a better 300 series if you don't also change the naming scheme. They should have gone straight to RX and gotten rid of the X bullshit and just gone with this. And then you have here's Tonga, which I basically just have the 380X kept here, which should have been sold at launch, not just later. Just ridiculously. This card really was pretty close to a 970 for less money with more. Well, now we know more RAM. This is a 3.5 gigabyte card. Not going to get into that in this video. But yeah. And I think they could have cut down the Tonga a little more given it 3 gigabytes at 192-bit, and this would have just obliterated the 960 and the 950 with 3 gigabytes. And then they could have afforded to sell it a little less, not have these two cards that are almost the same performance, the 380X and the 380. That just didn't make sense having both exist. And it would have been way better than selling, of course, the GCN 1.0 series cards that just confused everyone to hell. And these would have also been very good, this cut-down card on laptops, actually. An excellent laptop card. And then going down the list, this is when I say it's okay to rebrand, right? You can reuse this die down here, but don't go to GCN 1.0, because GCN 1.0 requires, crossfire connectors, or, doesn't have the newest HDMI or DisplayPort. It's just confusing. Two at the most. Can't go below 2. And yeah, that's how I see this series. If you look at how they're priced, how they're organized, I think it would have been a bold move, but a smart move to make this a Titan killer instead of a 980 Ti competitor, because you're not going to beat the 980 Ti. You can't make this cheap, but you can make it more expensive and cheaper than the Titan and make sense long term. And you could have made a slightly cheaper version of the Fury if you combine the mentality going with the Nano and the Fury itself, and then just let AIBs run wild. Make 8 gigabyte cards if they want, and then of course they should have made a different die here instead of rebranding the 390X. And the last thing I'll add about this is, I know there's some people who say AMD was cash strapped, they couldn't afford this. Yes, they could have. They could have afforded to make a big I call it, big Tonga die if they wanted to. And the reason I really think they could have is all the effort they basically put into weird versions of Furies and rebranding the 390X, which the 390X wasn't a complete rebrand of the 290X. They did retool a couple of things and make a new BIOS. I'm just going to say that the amount of money to make design a big Tonga, which is effectively a GCN 3.0 update to the 290X, it would have been, I'm sorry, it would have been worth every penny, and I'm sure they could have afforded it. And frankly, if they couldn't have afforded it, then they should have made the 390 and 390X 4 gigabyte cards and sold them for less money, because it just made no sense having these expensive 8 gigabyte cards that use too much energy and make the Fury series look awkward. But yeah, that's how I would have done this. The truth truly is that Maxwell would have crushed AMD that generation to a certain extent, but it didn't have to be a skull crushing. AMD didn't have to be their worst enemy. They could have just accepted that sometimes you have products that compete with this one, and you're never going to make it compete with this one. They could have not been lazy and actually made sure you don't have an awkward lineup that goes all over the place in features, whether it's crossfire cables required or different display ports and HDMI outputs. They didn't have to do that to themselves. But this was really the culmination of the old Radeon that was losing to Nvidia. After this, we got the Polaris series that actually had a very clean naming scheme. And since then, their naming scheme's been way better. I really think this was... If you go back, you can watch Lisa Su on stage. I believe it was at E3 showing the Fury, saying this is the meme of an overclocker's dream. Which, frankly, if you modify the BIOS, Fury was actually a decent overclocker, but at launch it was horrible. And you could see in her eyes that she knew this wasn't going to go well. And I think she took a lot of that to heart, and since then AMD's learned a lot of its lesson. At least I hope they have. Because when I see RX 5700, I'm like, they're really changing their naming scheme again. I like the idea kind of going to RX 3000 so it lined up with the Ryzen 3000 series launch, but now it's not lined up, and you go, oh my god, HD 7000 to R9 200 to R9 300 to RX 400, and now we're going to RX 5000. It's all very confusing, if you ask me, and I hope, at the very least, whatever they do with this RX 5000 series, they learn their lessons from their worst segmentation in history. They segment the lineup correctly, they price it correctly, they put the right amounts of VRAM, and the naming system makes sense. Because that was really the worst part of the 300 series, is the ridiculous naming system. But I think they will, to I at least because it seems like AMD knows what it's doing now. And they sure as hell didn't seem to back then, and they kind of lost their mind at the worst time, didn't they? Well, I'll stop rambling. I hope you liked this video. I thought it was an interesting look at at what many would consider an impossible task, fending off an enemy with a new technology. But if you had a little bit of hindsight, I'm sure they could have done some things better. And there were things they just should have known better to do. Like, subscribe, share, support me on Patreon. I'm launching a podcast soon, building a website. Not sure if any of that will be up by the time this video comes out. Probably not. But I have been working on that. And so if there's a slowdown in videos, it's because I'm working on the other things you guys are asking me for. But I'm still taking time to do these videos I'm sure you guys really want to see. Thank you.